Good morning and welcome to the JCC of Metro Detroit's 69th Annual Jewish Book Fair. My name is Brenda Brook and I'm the chair of the Book Fair Steering Committee, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on this Wednesday morning to hear Howard Blum talk about his book, Night of the Assassins, the untold story of Hitler's plot to kill FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. This morning's event is presented in partnership with the 2020 Ann Arbor Jewish Book Festival. The goal of the Detroit Jewish Book Fair is to bring the best new Jewish books and authors from around the world to Metro Detroit. And this year, we might all be sitting in different rooms, but that goal remains the same. The book fair runs through December 9th, and we have an exceptional lineup of events planned. To see our full schedule and learn about ways to support book fair, watch events you may have missed, and find our online bookstore where you can buy Night of the Assassin and plenty of other great books, visit our website at culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. This year, in order to provide as much programming to the community as possible, we've made all our events free of charge. So if you enjoy this event and other book fair events, please consider becoming a patron or donating to book fair. You can do either or both at our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/book fair. We rely on community support to make this event possible, so thank you in advance for becoming part of our family. The book fair team would like to thank the following sponsor for their support: the Michael and Elaine Serling Institute for Jewish Studies and Modern Israel at Michigan State University. We have a really special event for you this morning, and we want you to be a part of it. You can ask questions and offer comments in the YouTube comment section or by texting to the number in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Our speakers have a great discussion prepared, and they'll take as many of your questions as they can. And while you're here at our YouTube channel, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the reminder bell, and that way you'll never miss any of our exciting events. The focus of this morning's event is the book Night of the Assassins. We have with us the author, Howard Blum, as well as Yael, Aronoff, who will moderate the discussion. Night of the Assassins reads like a suspenseful thriller, but it's the true story of the Nazi plot to kill the leaders in the United States, Great Britain, and the USSR during World War II. Howard Blum was twice nominated for a Pulitzer Prize while working at the New York Times. He's a contributing editor at Vanity Fair and author of the New York Times bestseller Dark Invasion. He won the Edgar Award for American Lightning, and his book In the Enemy's House is a New York Times notable book. Yael Aronoff, our moderator this morning, is the director of the Michael and Elaine Serling Institute for Jewish Studies and Modern Israel, and is the Serling Chair in Israel Studies at Michigan State University, where she's also an associate professor of international relations. Please join me in welcoming Howard Blum and Yael Aronoff.
Well, it's such a pleasure to be able to talk to you and discuss this phenomenal book with you. Even as a professor also of international relations and Middle East studies and U.S. foreign policy and Israel studies, I learned so much from the book. And I read part of it with my husband, who's a literature professor, and we heard part of it on the audio of the book. And we both loved it, and he loved it also from the writing perspective. It was very suspenseful. And almost you could see a movie playing as you read the book between the Nazi spy and then FDR's bodyguard as kind of two protagonists who are kind of competing with each other in some ways. It was thrilling to read. And I'm sure that you may have had some interest from Hollywood as well. So I wanted to ask you about that because we might anticipate not only being able to read this phenomenal book, but being able to see it as well.
Yes, well, first, thanks for your kind and generous words. They're very flattering and they're appreciated. And yeah, the book came out in June, and it wasn't shortly after that I got a call from the two men who created Homeland, the TV series, and also 24 they did before that TV series. And they, together with Sony Pictures, have gotten together to develop the book with my help and with a director by the name of Jonathan Mostow, and all working together to make this a 6 to 8 hour limited series. And it's flattering, it's fascinating, it's also an education for me to see. When I wrote the book, as a former Times reporter, I was limited to telling the truth. I had to tell a true story. Here we can take some dramatic liberties. I'm imagine by the time the book finally gets aired on the screen, there'll be a great deal more dramatic liberties. And it was interesting to me what they picked up on. As you had said in your introduction, I had sort of structured the book as a cat and mouse game between two people or two sides. On one side was Mike Riley, FDR's bodyguard, and he is a former college football star from a small silver mining town in Montana. He's 31 years old at the time of Pearl Harbor, and just 2 days after Pearl Harbor, he's given this job of protecting FDR. He's promoted ahead of other people, more experienced agents, and he's sort of overwhelmed. He says with self-deprecating humor, he's an Irish cop with more brawn than brains. But there's more than just humor going on there. He really feels a sense of imposter syndrome, that he's not up to the task for a couple of reasons. One, this is the first war where the American president can be attacked by troops that can send paratroopers to land on the White House lawn. They can send their enemy bombers across oceans to drop bombs on the White House. And two, FDR presents a unique target. He's paralyzed from the waist down. He can't walk. He's quite literally a sitting target. And there's a third component to Mike Riley's challenge. He grew up in this town in Montana, a silver mining town. His father was an alcoholic miner who left the family when Mike was 9. And in FDR, he's found the father he never had. His commitment is both a professional commitment and one of genuine affection. He's really dedicated to keeping FDR safe because he cares about him. And so on this side, you have the Americans, and we'll talk, I'm sure, about the Germans a bit as we continue.
I had 2 follow-up questions from that. One is, you said that the movie series that will come out of this will probably take even more dramatic liberties. You used, I saw, kind of documented sources, and I think even the bodyguard Mike's memoir, perhaps. But you brought it alive in a very compelling way. So one question I had is reading it is, what liberties did you take, or how did you fill in those gaps to make such a compelling story from the sources you had? And secondly, since you brought up kind of the fact that FDR kind of was in the wheelchair and immobile, and it seemed like a prominent part of the story as making a more vulnerable target, I wanted you to speak to that a little bit more too, as to the role that played and the prominence you gave it. I come from a kind of political psychology and leadership background, so I wrote a book on the political psychology of Israeli prime ministers, and a colleague of mine, Rose McDermott, wrote a fascinating book on illness and the American presidents. And so she talks about things like that, about how kind of physical disabilities affect presidents, and you gave it such a prominent role that I wanted you to I wanted to hear more about that choice as well.
Sure. Well, first, your first question about the truth in all this. When I picked these books to write, and I've been doing this for a while, you need certain source material. My goal as a writer is to make it seem real, but I also have to tell the truth. So you have to take a topic where there are memoirs, where you can get inside people's heads, what they're actually saying, where there are source documents. And all the primary people in this discussion, in this book, both the Germans and Mike Riley, had all written their memoirs. I could actually say what they were feeling, what they were thinking. Churchill has written his memoir. There's been a great deal written about FDR. There are records of his press conferences at the Tehran conference itself. So I was able to create that with a good deal of accuracy. I did not take dramatic license. Anytime something appears in the book in quotes, it's something they actually said, and one can source. And I choose my scenes carefully. I need this information to create my scenes. In a movie, you will have to invent interactions. You will have to create scenes that just no one can be privy to except the participants. And what they're doing in this film, there were a couple of real life characters that I don't play up in the book too much because I couldn't get to their details, but I could see how a filmmaker could find them fascinating. For example, there are two OSS men in Tehran already. The OSS is the precursor to the CIA. It was the United States government's wartime spy unit. And these two guys who are sent to Tehran are 25-year-old graduate students, one from Harvard, one from Princeton, very tweety types. They're chosen to go to Iran because they know a great deal about ancient Persian kings, but they don't know anything about what's happening in the streets of Tehran. And so the only person they can recruit to find out from the streets is someone from the motor pool, a 25-year-old sergeant who is a musician, and they send him into a nightclub in Tehran, which is where the German expatriates hang out. So these are the small facts that are mentioned sort of in passing in the book. In the film version, they figure more prominently. Now, as to your other questions about FDR's disabilities, I mean, the thing that struck me so much about FDR was his great personal courage. I mean, he couldn't walk. He was paralyzed from the waist down. He has to go from Washington, D.C., across the world, 5,000 miles to Tehran. He has to go through U-boat-infested Atlantic Ocean. He has to fly over North African battlefields where, the tanks are still smoking on the ground. He has to spend time first in Cairo, where there's Luftwaffe bomber battalions located in Rhodes and in Greece. I mean, he is literally a sitting target. Churchill, too, is put in great danger. But these two men, because they realize how important it is for the future of the war to meet face-to-face with Stalin. They're going to meet with Stalin to plan D-Day. FDR wants America to cross the English Channel, go through France directly to Berlin. Churchill, however, is fighting with him. And Churchill wants the Allied invasion to go through what he calls the soft underbelly of Europe, through Italy, up through France, into Germany. The reason he wants this is he wants to control the English Channel after the war, and he wants to maintain the British Empire, India. So this is very important to him. Stalin, meanwhile, after all the losses, 20 million Russians, 20 million are going to die in this war, in the course of this war, and he wants the war to end as quickly as possible. And so he is insisting that the Allies come to see him in Tehran. He's not going to go anyplace else. He refuses to meet closer. First, FDR wanted to go to Fairbanks, Alaska, to have this meeting. Stalin refused, so they go all the way to Tehran at great personal risk to see if they can end the war and also create the peace. And to talk about the dangers that confronted Roosevelt during this journey. He sneaks out of Washington on a small boat that takes him out to sea to meet the USS Iowa, which is the largest battleship in the world. It's as long as the Empire State Building is tall, just about. He gets on the ship and they're heading out to the Atlantic Ocean. The third day out, the captain of the USS Iowa, who's an old friend of FDR's, wants to put on a show for him. And on the boat are the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of FDR's advisors, and they're in a flotilla of boats, a combat battalion, but none of the other boats know that FDR is on that boat. The Tehran conference is going to North Africa and then on to the Middle East as a complete secret. So they have a demonstration. They send up target balloons and they start shooting them, and it's quite a great show. FDR is sitting on deck. and enjoying it. Meanwhile, another destroyer, a U.S. destroyer in this convoy, figures they'll use this time to practice their torpedo launching. And they sight the Iowa in their sights, and they're going to launch a dummy torpedo. This U.S. captain, by mistake, launches a live torpedo. It heads right towards the Iowa. It just misses by yards. At that moment, we could have lost an American president in the midst of a war by friendly fire. So these were the dangers that FDR faced, and he was a man of great personal courage.
I'm glad that you brought up that last example, because that made a big impression on me in reading the book. You know, those empty shells and ordinary procedures that were being shot, not knowing FDR was on the boat and just slimly missing him. And that kind of made me think. I wanted to ask you whether in your book there are different ways of looking at history, and of course the way you seem to build it, or I want to ask you the way you see it, is that it's very contingent on individuals. And while I look at it in my classes and research in terms of leaders and the contingencies of that, you're also looking at kind of these procedures on the ship, that he could have been killed at sea before he even got there at different stages. Perhaps, you know, all three leaders could have been killed in various ways. So to what extent, kind of reflecting, or as you're writing this book, are you kind of conceptualizing history as one that's very kind of contingent on serendipitous events and on the agency of particular individuals? That seemed to strike me as I was reading.
You know, there's that famous statement by Marx: men make their own history, but it's determined by the times in which they live. And very much so, the history of World War II was determined by great men caught up in the times in which they live. You know, Churchill was a leader for his time, and he depended upon the U.S., but it was a very combative and contentious relationship. The 5 days of meetings in Tehran are filled with various conflicts between these men, and Stalin too. At one point, there's a dinner at the Soviet embassy in Tehran. And the three leaders have been meeting for a while. And at this dinner, Stalin gets up and says, the only way we can have a peace after the war is if 50,000 German officers are killed. That's what it will take, 50,000. Churchill's sitting there and he's shocked. He says, the British people will never abide by the killing of 50,000 people. And Stalin reiterates, no, we've got to kill 50,000 people after the war, 50,000 German officers. And the tension is building in the room. So FDR tries to deflate the moment, and he says, jocularly, well, how about we only kill 49,000? And at that point, Churchill has had enough, and he steams out of the room, goes into a dark room in the next door in the Russian embassy. There are no lights on. He doesn't know where he is. He's sitting there fuming. He doesn't know if this is going to be the end of the conference. He's sitting there for a couple of minutes, and suddenly he feels a hand on his shoulder, and it's Stalin with his interpreter. And he says, oh, I was only kidding. Please come back and join us. But Churchill writes in his memoirs, it says, I never thought for a moment that Stalin was kidding. So this is the tension of these three men at this conference, while they're sitting there talking matters of state, and at the same time, for 5 days, well-trained Nazi assassins are on this loose in a city of Tehran. 1 million people. It's a cat and mouse game with the clock ticking down to see if Mike Riley, the Americans, and the Russians can track them down, or that these guys can execute their very carefully designed plot. Should we talk about their plot for a minute?
Sure. Go ahead.
First, General Walter Schellenberg is in charge of the SS spy department. He's 33 years old at this point, same age as Mike Riley, coincidentally. And Schellenberg is the youngest general in the entire German army at 33. And I said he's in the SS, but he's not your typical SS man. He's more of a, he's not a true believer in Hitler. And what he joined the SS out of sheer pragmatism. It's a way to get ahead. And he sees that when Germany loses the war, unless something can be done to make a negotiated peace, the gilded life he envisioned for himself is just not going to happen. So he sort of directs this spy mission, and he comes up with a strategy, in a sense, for it to be executed. He has to first find a day when he knows the three world leaders, the three allied leaders will be together. A time when they'll be with their guards will be relaxed, they will be more relaxed, and he can be sure that despite all their tensions, they will show up in the same room. And he starts doing research, and he finally finds that November 30th will be Churchill's 69th birthday party. And he can deduce that there will be a party that evening at the British Embassy where the three men will come and that they'll be together. And he decides that will be the time for the attack. While these three men are singing "Happy Birthday, Dear Winston," his assassins will come sneaking through the night to deliver Hitler's birthday gift to Churchill and the Allied leaders. Now, how are they going to get past the guards around the embassy? The three Allied leaders, as you can imagine, were the most carefully and well-protected men in the world. Well, of all the places in the world for the Allies to pick, they picked Tehran, where the Nazis have been running spies for several years, since the start of the war, and even before the war, they had a spy network in Tehran. And the Nazi station chief in Tehran had discovered that one of the first things you learn in Tehran is that the water is terrible. Typhoid is prevalent everywhere throughout the city of 1 million people. They have water canals on the side of the road, and these are filled with just tepid water. It's really a vile situation. But the US Embassy, the British Embassy, and the American Embassy, thanks to the American engineers, have water tunnels that bring in fresh water from the mountains into these sites. So this field agent has realized that he can send these well-trained Nazi assassins into these tunnels. Into these tunnels, they can sneak beneath the guards in front of the embassy, get up into the embassy grounds, and on the night of Churchill's birthday, they can rise up from the water tunnels across the grounds of the embassy in the darkness with their rifles ready to burst into the dining room on this night of the assassin. So that's the plot that's set in motion. And over these 4 days of the conference, the Germans are trying to get into position while Mike Riley, working with the Russians, is trying to stop them.
And it's certainly a riveting story. As you mentioned, it's kind of a ticking, time bomb almost kind of feel almost like 24. Actually, my husband and I were mentioning to each other, so it's funny.
That's why they keep on saying, yes.
The makers of 24 are going to be involved in your episode. So I had two questions that emanate from that. One is that it brings up kind of issues of ethics and intelligence, perhaps, in trying to stop this ticking time bomb, right? Because it seems like, not to reveal too much, but a German intelligence person, imprisoned intelligence person, ends up revealing perhaps some information before we know it was aborted, right? And so it raises questions into, it doesn't really go into how this person was interrogated or how this, whether he was just exhausted or whether there was torture involved. So that was kind of one kind of curious question that came up. And secondly, you brought in the, one of the protagonists kind of the book, which is this German spy, Walter Schellenberg. And you kind of portray him, I think, with some complexity, where on one hand, he seems to be against perhaps the massacre of Jews, you claim. On the other hand, he's kind of complicit and kind of wants to do this in order to kind of save Germany and perhaps have individuals save themselves in the aftermath of the war. You say in the epilogue that he was as a consequence of an Allied tribunal. He was sentenced and imprisoned for 6 years. But I also have a question into what your thinking was into how you treat some of these Nazi spies with a certain kind of complexity that offers them some degree of respect. Might be too strong on one hand, but on the other hand humanizes them. So I'm kind of interested in how you kind of sought to portray them, as well as kind of the ethics issues of intelligence that you bring up in this story.
Portraying villains is, in real life or in fiction, is complex. You want to portray, any SS man is a priori a war criminal, a villain. At the same time, Schellenberg was surrounded by thugs. The men he worked with, those SS men, were on the front lines. He never was in combat. He never was part of an Einsatzgruppen. He just was the banality of evil. Someone who thought he could get ahead by doing this. And yet, what made him interesting to me is someone who plots a very careful career for himself, who sees himself rising up from lower middle class roots. His father was a piano salesman that didn't do well. The family was moving from town to town. He suddenly is making it. He has a large apartment in Berlin, a country home. He's gotten rid of his first wife and married better the second time. He's going to meetings with the Nazi press. And he suddenly realizes in January 27th, 1943, FDR is at the Casablanca conference, and he makes a statement saying that the Allies are going to fight until the unconditional surrender of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Now, up to this point, Schellenberg and the Nazi high command in general, was thinking about the possibilities of a negotiated peace. They realized the war had been lost on the battlefield after the German army had been encircled at Stalingrad, after the successful Allied invasion of North Africa. Now that the US was in the war and our bombers were coming off the assembly line, Germany wasn't going to win this war on the battlefield. But Germany thought they could snatch a stalemate from the jaws of defeat. They could keep on fighting. The Allies would grow weary. They could negotiate a peace. Maybe the Reich would be allowed to survive. The Germans could keep the plunder. They could keep part of their eastern territories that they had conquered. But now this unconditional surrender meant that Schellenberg and all his cohorts would have to answer for their crimes against humanity. They would have to answer for their crimes against the Jews. They would appear before Allied tribunals. And the verdict, they knew they'd be hung unless something could be done. And this was the genesis for Schellenberg's very pragmatic decision to try to come up with a plan for killing the 3 Allied leaders. If you could change this leadership, he thought, you wouldn't win the war, but you'd be able to perhaps form a peace. And that's what was driving him. And that sort of nuanced personality, to me, was quite interesting.
Are there any lessons that you would draw for today in terms of intelligence and intelligence cooperation among countries, assassinations? I mean, there was very interesting also relationships between the American and British and Russian intelligence, and what the Russian intelligence was sharing, the degree to which they were sharing with America. So I don't know, kind of, if someone's looking at it kind of from today's perspective, whether there are any kind of lessons to be drawn from the history that you've brought us.
Well, it seems that, a priori, assassinations are illegal, whatever. However, we're just looking at a time where an Iranian nuclear scientist was assassinated. Now, this man, and he's the 5th Iranian nuclear scientist to be assassinated. Israel has never accepted or announced that they are responsible. But when a country is out to destroy you, you can see the logic for assassination. The timing of this particular assassination is maybe unfortunate. I don't know how advanced this man was and what was going to happen, but it certainly makes the peace process a little harder. And it seemed to be moving forward this summer with the UAE's acceptance of Israel, with Saudi Arabia and Israel coming closer together. It was perhaps an ill-timed. I don't know enough of the facts. But before one, condemns the Germans for a plot to kill the three Allied leaders during, this was wartime. This was declared war, and you were trying to win, or at least get a peace. And the U.S. had shot down a Japanese general. So while assassinations are illegal in international law, so is, for example, what Iran is doing today by sending missiles to its proxy states and selling arms to them that threaten Israel. So if the assassination of this nuclear leader, of this nuclear scientist, helps preserve Israel, well, it becomes a lot less evil and maybe a pragmatic necessity. So these are sort of the ethical concerns one has. And I've been reading all the stories in the papers about the assassination of the nuclear scientist, and they keep on changing. First, it was a band of well-trained assassin Israeli Mossad commandos. Then it was done by drone. Then it was done by a remote-controlled machine. And it just sort of points out, I'm thinking, how hard it is to get the details of what actually happened in these events, and why, for example, the story I tell was covered up for so many years until about 8 years ago, the Russians first decided, the SVR, which is the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, they declassified a treasure trove of documents. And in these documents revealed the events that happened in Tehran. And that allowed me to go step by step through archives in Britain, Germany, and America to try to put the top secret pieces of the puzzle together. And that, and using memoirs of participants. But you can see the challenges. The business of intelligence agencies is keeping secrets. It's capital that they never want to spend. And so for a reporter to try to get the truth, as we can see today, and also even back to World War II, it's a difficult event.
And so I can imagine, going back to the earlier question, that you may not have the information available to know how the information, how we got the information from the German spy who was imprisoned to eventually be able to abort the operation or get the information that was needed. I assume we don't know how and if he was interrogated, in terms of that and the ethics involved there.
I'm sure he was interrogated,
Right.
but the files don't exist. It's interesting. The way this story first became known, somewhat, the first tip of the iceberg, December 17th, 2 weeks after the Tehran conference, FDR comes back to America. It's now been announced to the world that the Tehran conference took place. Before that, it was secret. He gives a press conference in the Oval Office. He's seated at his desk. Behind him is Mike Riley standing like a sentinel behind him. And the press is assembled in front of him. And there's an actual recording of this press conference. I listened to it at the FDR library. It's at Hyde Park, New York. And the Times ran a piece on this press conference the next day. And FDR is talking about what went on at the conference. And about 10 minutes into his discussion with the reporters, he said, we had a security problem. There were some Nazi assassins loose in the city. And you can hear the room sort of go quiet. And then FDR gives a chuckle. He starts laughing in this sort of very carefully controlled laugh of his. And he says, it would have been a pretty good haul if they'd gotten all three of us. And he then laughs uproariously. The press joins in. And then what was most amazing to me, but FDR says, but let me tell you what happened with China. And they move on to talk about that. And they just let this story sit there. I mean, talk about a compliant and complacent press. There's some American presidents who might have liked that more recently, but they let this just pass, and the whole story was sort of buried for generations. It was mentioned in a couple of books that came out after the war, which were filled with pseudonyms, and then until the Russians revealed their documents, the story was really unknown.
I just want to remind people that you're also free in the audience to write questions for Howard Blum in the comments. So a question I had, and that kind of the story of kind of the end, how, you know, the press didn't even ask about this momentous aborted event. It seems like embedded in the whole kind of narrative and history is kind of the counterfactual of what difference this, because I mean, the dramatic difference this may have made. I mean, just if nothing else, just killing 3 leaders, but it makes one think what else could have happened differently had this succeeded. So I don't know. It kind of, the book really begs kind of us all to think about that and that counterfactual. I don't know if kind of that's something that you were thinking of as you were writing the book.
In these times, I mean, we've seen more than ever how important, leadership is. We're all living at a time. I wrote this book. I was trying to put myself in the shoes of someone living through World War II. Wondering would I have the ingenuity, the courage, what was ever takes to protect my family, protect myself, to live each day without knowing what was going to happen next, to try to confront previously unimaginable events one day after another. Well, now, wishing I could find that sort of talent, that writerly ability to do that. Well, now, be careful what you wish for, because it's happening to all of us. And we also see how important leadership is. I mean, I'm not comparing a pandemic to World War II, but there's not another nation trying to take our treasure, replace our philosophy with theirs, or take control of our country. But we are, in many ways, fighting for our lives. We're fighting for our future. We're hoping we can get through this with our economy, with our health, with our institutions intact. And to get through that, as in World War II, we are relying on our leaders. The election that happened just a month ago from today was really, I believe, a referendum on what sort of leadership we want to take America through the pandemic or war that we're now fighting. And and we'll see what the difference will be. We'll see if America will be safer, if we'll all be safer, how it will go. But at that time, we can get a sense, I think a chilling sense, of what hung in the balance if we had lost all 3 of the Allied leaders in the middle of the war. Will America have the energy, the resilience to keep on fighting, or we would hurry for a negotiated peace? Might we have decided to drop an atom bomb on Germany out of vengeance? It certainly would have changed the world as we know it. I mean, the stakes were enormous. Well, what was going on between the 2 sides during 5 days in Tehran in 1943?
Mm-hmm. I wanted to also ask you about the process by which you find your stories, and this one in particular, and you compose the narratives, as well as kind of what was most surprising to you as you maybe were uncovering this history and writing this.
Well, as I said before, the key to telling these stories is you have to have characters that can guide you through it. And you have to know what the characters are thinking and feeling, and you want to convey that on the page. And at the same time, it has to be a true story. It has to be the sort of story that could appear on the pages of the New York Times. Everything has to be documented. So I must find a story. While it's dramatic, I have to find a story where there are these source documents, where there are memoirs, where the people are saying what they're thinking and feeling, where there are contemporary press reports. I need these sort of building blocks that will allow me to create the drama. And also, when I'm looking for a story, one of the good things about being a writer is you can learn something. It's still like going to college. That's fun. That's exciting. And so I want to take a story that I will enjoy spending several years putting the pieces together, designing the narrative approach, the strategy, and I'll learn something new and I'll have a bit of an education. And I think if I'm interested, well, then maybe there'll be some readers that'll be interested. As to what I found most surprising, I think how appallingly close the Nazis got to succeeding, how amateurish was the US response. We pick a city, any place in the world, we allow Tehran to be picked by Stalin as where the conference should take place. 5,000 miles away from Washington. The head of our team is Mike Riley. He didn't even know where Tehran was. When FDR tells him we're going to Tehran, he has to go to a map, a globe, to find out where it is. He didn't even know where Iran was on the map. We have our spies, our intelligence network there. They're two 25-year-old kids who I said who knew about Persian kings, but not what was going on in the city. And the Nazis were well trained. They were led by this man called Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny was a dyed-in-the-wool Nazi. He was a commando. He was you think of your Aryan Superman, 6'4", broad-shouldered, drooling scar on his cheek, and he was totally dedicated to leading this mission. Nothing was going to stop him. He was going to make his place in history by being the most gallant soldier ever. And he trained these men at a camp called Oranienburg, these assassins, and he sent them off into Tehran, and that they would be able to be on the loose till the final day of the conference and get so close to putting their plan into motion, to making their way towards these water tunnels. That to me was the most shocking part of the whole story.
Okay, I see a question from Carol Corlitz. It seems as if there's no end to World War II stories that can be told. Do you see your audience for this among all ages, and would you keep writing World War II stories?
Well, I'd like to think a bit of history that people don't know about and that's suspenseful to boot would be for all ages, sure. And I've written about World War II before. I did a book called The Last Good Night, which is about a female spy, an American debutante who becomes a spy, and she sort of uses the bedroom as her operational battlefield. Time magazine said what James Bond did with a Beretta, she did with the bed. So I've written about World War II. I've also written a book called The Brigade, about the Jewish Brigade, a group of Jewish soldiers from Palestine who, as the war is ending, Britain allows them to go fight in Europe. And this is really the first Jewish fighting force, organized Jewish fighting force since the Maccabees. And they go off and fight in the last battles of the war in Italy. And then what happens to them after the war is even more interesting as they go on a campaign for vengeance. And yet this vengeance moves to something more important. And they try to save Jewish children that become the foundation of the Israeli Defense Force in 1948. So I have written about that area before. Will I write about it again? Perhaps. My next story is a more contemporary spy story.
Well, we'd love to hear about what your next story is, and then I have a follow-up to that. Yeah, go ahead. What is your next project? Yeah.
Well, the next project is 1978. We're on the Chesapeake Bay, and there's a boat floating lazily on board. The Coast Guard sees it. They seems to be in some distress. They go out there. They find some bullets littered on the deck. They go downstairs. They see papers marked top secret, and there's a radio that's going on that's burbling, making noises. It's later identified to be a burst transmitter, which is only used for communicating with satellites. And they can't find the owner of the boat, and the owner of the boat, it turns out, is a top CIA official. 5 days later, his body is found wrapped in chains in the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay. It manages to float up. And for the next 20 years, a family of spies tries to figure out what really happened and how it involves in their own life. And one man's being forced out of the Central Intelligence Agency. It's a journey that starts in the Chesapeake Bay and ends 20 years later in Moscow. So that'll be the next book.
Wow, we're riveted. For those of you who haven't yet read Howard Blum's current book, I really encourage you to do so, and we'll be looking for your next book as well. How do you decide how to write the narrative? It unfolds like a novel or a mystery story, and you don't reveal things like the birthday the date of the birthday date of the assassination until the last chapters, when the planners knew, of course, early in the book. So this is very, this is different than a kind of story a strict historian would tell. So how do you make those narrative decisions?
Well, my goal, as I said, is to tell first a true story and then to make it an engaging story. I want to make it a page turner. I admit that. I concede that. At the same time, I want it to be true. So you have to find your narrative point of view. You have to find the characters that can get you through the story. As I said, I use Mike Riley, this 33-year-old Irish cop from a small town in Montana to get me through the story because he wrote his memoir, and I can say what he's thinking and feeling. In the movie, they're going to concentrate on these two young spies who work with someone from the motor pool because they're younger and they feel that would be even more exciting for a film audience. But they don't have to tell a true story. I do. So I'm sort of limited this way. So where I can create drama from the facts and to try to find the point of view into the story, that's the biggest challenge, takes the most planning. As I said, I found Mike Riley for Night of the Assassins. For the next book, I found a family of spies, a father who was sort of forced out to the agency. His daughter is in the agency and she marries the CIA man who is the son of the father's chief rival. And that family interaction will guide me through solving this mystery of the boat floating on the Chesapeake Bay.
So how much will you be consulted when they make this kind of a more Hollywood series? Do you have any guidance that you can give, or is it basically you're done and they're kind of have complete creative license? Or
well, I've been through this before a couple of times, and to be candid, in the past, I had 3 kids I was sending through fancy private schools and fancy colleges, and now they're out in the world. I've done all that, so the pressure is off. I don't have to pay those tuitions, so I don't have to give in so quickly. So in this new situation, maybe I've gotten less up front, but I have a good deal of say in it, so that I don't have to worry about the Harvard tuition bills.
Fantastic. We have another question that's posted from Carol Kravitz. Students desperately need to see how to use primary source documents. Have you thought of teaching a writing class?
Have I thought about teaching a writing course? I don't know if I'm ready. No, I've never really thought about teaching. I so enjoy writing, and one of the good things about writing is you can learn. You learn, and now I'm working with the people on this project, the Night of the Assassins TV series. I'm learning how to write a TV series, so maybe I'll do that next. Maybe I'll do some screenwriting next, but not teaching. But I don't know. If the right opportunity came, perhaps I would. But
well, we also have a question from the audience that says, "Do you know who the stars are of the upcoming movie?" And I also was kind of interested in how you got into journalism and this version of journalism. Yeah.
Well, I don't know who the stars are yet, and anything they tell me is probably a lie at this point. I think you need a script to before you get a real commitment. My book, Dark Invasion, for example, it was bought by Bradley Cooper. And Bradley Cooper, was all gung-ho. And then the script came in by someone called Taylor Sheridan. It was very talented, but it just wasn't a good script. And now Bradley Cooper is less gung-ho, but he owns it, so we'll see. How I got into this? Well, I became a journalist. I was going to school in Europe, London School of Economics, 100 years ago. And there was a paper called The Village Voice, and I sent something in about a demonstration around the American embassy back then, and they printed it, and that was pretty cool. I thought I was, 18 years old in print, and I've been doing it ever since. After college, then graduate school, I went to work for the Village Voice for a number of years, and the Times hired me, and I wrote my first book, Wanted, and that was a bit of a success. So I was able to leave the Times and start writing these nonfiction books. And now my youngest daughter of the three kids is at the Times working as a news assistant, but she's gotten about 50 bylines. She got out of school. It's almost 2 years now out of college. So she's there too. So she's sort of following in that tradition that you get things published. And she started writing for the Huffington Post and the Daily Beast and the University of Pennsylvania paper until the Times hired her.
Fantastic. You're a proud father. We have yet another question posted from Susan Lutz. You mentioned FDR and that Americans were in a relatively weaker position to agree to the location of Tehran as a conference, as to where to hold the conference. Yet they did it again, allowing Stalin to select Yalta. So she wanted to get more of your thoughts kind of about the continued relative weakness of the U.S. in determining locations for these get-togethers.
It wasn't so much weakness, it was FDR's desire that the meeting take place. Why was this meeting ultimately so important to him? He was looking towards the future, towards the peace, and he had this vision that there would be three policemen, the US, Britain, and Russia, that would ensure peace forever. There would never be a world war again. And I think he knew his time on Earth was limited, and he wanted to make sure that this was done. There were first, I said he had thrown out Fairbanks, Alaska, and Stalin wasn't going to go there. He didn't want to leave the Soviet Union, go too far in the middle of a war. And Churchill very quixotically says, well, we can put 3 tents in the desert, and we'll be 3 wise men, and we'll meet there. And Stalin didn't even deign to answer that. Then they start talking about having a ship anchored off North Africa, because that would be safe. But Stalin keeps on holding to Tehran. And one of the reasons, it turns out later, he was afraid of flying. He didn't want to fly too far from Moscow. So that was close. And he also was able to send from Moscow 25,000 soldiers before the meeting to protect him. He thought he was very afraid of assassination.
Interesting. So what are some of the greatest literary influences on you?
Well, I like reading Jean le Carré. I think he's a master. I think he tells stories really well. I think Philip Roth is probably the greatest writer of my generation. I think he's a genius, and I just love reading and rereading his books. You can pick up one of his books, for example, The Ghostwriter. Is just telling a friend of mine last week, you want to start a book, read the opening page, the opening chapter of that, and how he sets the scene, and it just pulls you into that. Those are 2 writers I admire. When I was a young journalist starting out and trying to write narrative nonfiction as this is, I read a lot of Tom Wolfe. I've read a lot of Gay Talese, a lot of Norman Mailer, Truman Capote in Cold Blood. Those are wonderful books and were inspirations to me.
Well, those are fantastic authors as well, and we're big fans of Le Carré as well. My dad, who's also an academic, wrote a book on kind of ethics and politics of Le Carré's novels, so and had some correspondence with him about
and the cynicism.
Yeah. Well, we only have 5 minutes left, so I want to give you a chance to kind of leave us with any final thoughts that you have, since sometimes you prepare your own lectures on the book, and we had it more in the format of discussion, but I wanted to give you a chance to kind of close us with your final thoughts and impressions that we should take away.
Well, first of all, thank you for your insightful and well thought out questions. I appreciate the attention you gave to my book. It's very gratifying, and so thank you. And I appreciate, Detroit and inviting me to come. I was first here when I was 26 years old at the Detroit Book Fair for my first book, Wanted: The Search for Nazis in America, which was probably 48 years ago. So I have ties to the Detroit Book Fair community, so thank you. And as for this book, I think, one reason to read it, I think it'll be fun to see how the film miniseries differs. And I'll leave it to the readers to complain. I'll just be quite happy and gratified if it gets on the air. Just like hunting down the 3 Allied leaders seemed like an impossible mission. Well, so is getting from the deal to the script to the actual shooting of the movie often seems like an impossible mission too. So I look forward to how that happens. And maybe that's something I'll write about too one day.
Well, it's been an honor for us all to hear from you. And for those of you who haven't yet had a chance to read the book, I recommend highly that through the website that was given at the beginning, you order the book. Someone asked for what ages is this appropriate. I would say all ages, because the narrative is so riveting that it's everyone would enjoy it, but also for history lovers, history of World War II lovers, political scientists, literature people, basically for everyone. And I can see the wide appeal of the book, which is why it was chosen to also be made into kind of a movie series that we really, really look forward to seeing. So it's been such a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you and to read your book, and I recommend it to everyone. And we look forward to seeing it on screen as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Howard and Yael, for being with us today and for such an absorbing, fascinating discussion. And thanks to all of you at home for joining us. Our next event is Lunchtime with the Authors today at 1:30, when we will hear Bess Kalb, author of Nobody Will Tell You This But Me, and Elaine Klassen, author of Love is a Rebellious Bird. So please bring your lunch and join us at 1:30. And remember to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and visit our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair for our full schedule, ways to get involved, and where you can buy Howard's book. Stay safe and have a great day.